Hey gang, in this video, let's go over how to use PREVGROUPVAL in summary and matrix reports. First, if you're not aware, PREVGROUPVAL is one of two Salesforce formulas specifically available in Salesforce reports to report on groupings. So if you're new and looking for a quick introduction, check out the linked video first. But otherwise, if you're looking for some advanced practice using PREVGROUPVAL, especially in reports with multiple groupings, then you're in the right place. Let's go over it now. Okay, here we have the formula syntax for PREVGROUPVAL. The first part of the formula calls for the summary field. This is the easy part. This represents the field value that you want to measure. So whether that's a currency amount, number, or percent, this part of the syntax is basically asking what is the thing that you want to summarize. The second part of the formula calls for us to specify the grouping level which we want to use for that calculation, which will either be one of your row groupings or your column groupings if you're dealing with matrix reports. When we specify this grouping in our PREVGROUPVAL syntax, what we're actually telling Salesforce is, hey, this is the grouping level that I want to use when I call on the summarized values from previous groupings in my report. Okay, moving on. Finally, we have the increment. This is optional, but it basically tells your formula the number of previous grouping levels which you want to pull that summarized data. I tend to visualize this like walking down a flight of stairs and dropping something on the way. The increment is asking which previous stair number to look at in order to grab the information you need. Except in this case, think of your stairs as your specific groupings. Okay, now even though I said the increment is optional, keep in mind that's because the default increment for this formula is 1. Meaning that if you don't specify an increment, the formula will return the previous grouping's value in your report. Okay, now while this next part isn't part of the formula, it's still an important piece for understanding how PREVGROUPVAL works. In the formula builder within the report builder, the display section determines where on the report layout the calculation should appear, and more specifically at which grouping level. So while it has nothing to do with the formula calculation itself, it's still critical for deciding how you want to present the results. So keep in mind that the PREVGROUPVAL formula doesn't change much between summary and matrix reports, unlike PARENTGROUPVAL, which uses two different syntaxes. So now that we've kind of got this part down, let's check it out in Salesforce. In this report, we have opportunities grouped by the close date year and fiscal period quarter. So that's two row groupings. Before we get into real-life use cases with PREVGROUPVAL, let's first practice getting that syntax right so that we call summarized values in all the right places. As a first exercise, let's grab the previous fiscal period amount and reflect that at each fiscal quarter grouping level. So here's what that'll look like when all is said and done. For Q4 2015, our PREVGROUPVAL function is going to reflect the 2.02 million that we see in Q3 2015. Because remember, that's what PREVGROUPVAL does. It grabs the summarized value of the previous report grouping. Now let's open the report builder. Let's create our summary formula. Since we're grabbing an amount, I'll select currency. And now let's plug in our formula syntax. Okay, so now let's plug everything in. Like I said, we want the sum of the opportunity amount. So I'll plug the opportunity amount into the summary field portion of the syntax. For our grouping level, we want to return the amount from the previous fiscal period quarter. So we'll specify the fiscal period grouping level. And finally, for the increment. Since we're only returning the previous row grouping, we don't have to set an increment here, because remember that increment is 1 by default. Okay, now for our display. We want to show this formula at the fiscal period level, so that's what we'll choose. And I'm pretty sure that if I wanted, I couldn't set another display level anyway based on my formula settings. So that's another helpful way of knowing how I should set the display in my report. Okay, let's save and run. Okay, here in the report, you can see that our formula is returning the total opportunity amount, our summarized value, from the previous fiscal period row grouping. Okay, so now let's transition into some increment practice. What if I wanted this formula to return the previous grouping value, but 2 levels up instead of 1? So basically, instead of returning the 2 million in Q4 2015, I want to return 60,000, which is 2 grouping levels prior. Let's open the formula builder. In our formula, we'll set the increment this time to 2. Now let's see what the report looks like. And there you go. Now our formula is returning the summarized value of the 2 previous groupings at each level instead of just the 1. Now for good measure, let's get some practice switching up these groupings. For this example, let's say we want to return the previous close date year total at each close date grouping level. Let's open our formula builder. It's an easy set of switches. Our grouping level will be close date instead of fiscal period. Since we're returning the amount of the first previous grouping level, we can remove our increment setup. And for our display, we'll set this to the close date level instead of fiscal period. Okay. Save and run. And there you go. You can see that our formula is returning the amount from the previous close date year at each close date year grouping. Now, for even more good measure, let's experiment by setting our increment to 5. But before we do, take a second to think about how that will look in this report. Let's go set it up. Okay, save and run. Okay, so let's take a look. The first value that we see returned in our formula is for calendar year 2021, which is pulling the annual total from 2015. The formula is working as expected. The 2015 row grouping is 5 places away from the 2021 row grouping level. And because 2015 is the first grouping level in the report, that means 2021 is the smallest year that can return a previous grouping level. Make sense? Because 2015 is the first grouping in the report, and 2016 through 2020 are all less than 5 grouping levels away, which is the increment that we set in our formula. So just keep this behavior in mind when you're setting up your increments. Now, this works very similarly for matrix reports. Let's get some practice there too. Here I have the same report, but with an extra column grouping for the stage. Let's set up the PREVGROUPVAL formula that we did for the second exercise, where we return the total amount for the previous close date year. In the formula builder we go. Let's set up our formula the way we had it before, where we were showing the opportunity amount sum at the close date year level. And remember, we had our display set to close date as well. Now, in this case for the display, we actually have to set both our row and our column grouping. So for our row grouping, we care about close date. And for our column grouping, let's start with the grand total for now and keep this as is. Now let's run the report and see how it looks. Okay, here you can see our formula. It's showing the close date year grouping, which is what we specified in the report. And it's showing this on two levels. Our close date year grouping, that's this, and the grand total for our column groupings. Now let's say instead of showing this at the grand total across all of the stages, we want to show this at each stage level grouping. Remember, that was the second option in our column display settings. So let's go in, let's make that switch, and then see what the report looks like. Okay, now you can see that instead of returning the value in the total column, the formula is only returning it within our stage column groupings for each year. Okay, so let's really break down how our formula is working here. Let's look at calendar year 2015. Our PREVGROUPVAL function is returning null values, which is basically nothing, for all of our stage groupings. And this is because calendar year 2015 is the first grouping level in our report. And PREVGROUPVAL is only going to return the previous grouping level. So this makes sense. Looking at calendar year 2017, the majority of these values are returning 0 because that was the value that was in 2015 for each stage. If we look at closed one, we're returning 2.425 million, which is the total opportunity amount from calendar year 2015. So hopefully that's making sense as we talk it through, because visually it can be a little confusing. So if we keep going down the list, we should basically see that our formula is returning whatever the total was from the previous calendar year. Okay, gang, final bit of exercise. Let's say we want to return the previous opportunity amount from the previous stage and show that within each stage grouping for each fiscal period. Now, you wouldn't probably really ever do this with opportunity stages, but the point here is just that you know how, because we are informed, well-rounded PREVGROUPVAL users. So let's go into the report builder and open the formula builder. Now, instead of our close date row grouping, I'm going to set our level to the stage column grouping instead. And then in the display, let's make sure we show this at the fiscal period and stage levels per our requirement. Okay, save and run. And voila, here is our formula showing the previous stage's grouping total for each fiscal period. Okay, gang, time for some realish examples. For this first requirement, let's say my team wants to see the difference between the previous year's total for each close date year grouping. So basically, by how much did calendar year 2018 change from calendar year 2017? So the calc for this requirement will be the current calendar year grouping minus the previous calendar year grouping. Now let's think about this one. We already know that we'll need to use PREVGROUPVAL to get the prior calendar year amount. But to get the current year, we can't use PREVGROUPVAL to do that. We'll need to use PARENT-GROUPVAL because PARENT-GROUPVAL grabs the parent group's totals, whereas PREVGROUPVAL can only look backwards. Okay, now let's open the report builder. First, I'm going to delete our practice formula so that we can start fresh. Now let's create the first formula. I'll just call it diff since we're grabbing the difference in total opportunity amount. Now let's build the skeleton of our calculation using just the formula syntax to start. Okay, so first, we know that we're only preoccupied with the sum of the opportunity amount, so let's plug that in now. And then for our groupings, we want to show the total per close date year. In our PREVGROUPVAL function, we'll plug in close date. And in our PREVGROUPVAL function, we'll set close date as our row grouping level. Now, PREVGROUPVAL actually requires us to select both a column grouping level and a row grouping level whenever we're working in matrix reports. For some reason, that part of the syntax doesn't automatically appear when you plug it into the formula builder. We only care to show amounts across close date year. We aren't concerned at all with our column grouping in this scenario, which is the stage. So instead of choosing stage as our column grouping, we'll use grand summary instead. If you're not sure why we're using grand summary here, I recommend watching the linked video at some point where we really break down how parent group val works in matrix reports. And finally, for our increment within our PREVGROUPVAL function, we only care to return the first previous grouping level, so we'll just nix that from our syntax. Okay, now for our display settings. I'm going to choose close date year for my row display because obviously that's part of our requirement. And for our column display, I only need to see this at the grand total level, again, not at the stage level. Okay, one more thing. Let's add some conditional formatting to highlight what we've done. I'll choose our formula field. And for our rules, I'm going to say that any negative number should appear in red, while any positive number appears in green. Okay, so put another way, I'm showing any decreases across years in red and any increases in green. Okay, save and run. And here we are, gang. We can clearly see the amount difference across years. And even though this report has 2 row groupings and 1 column grouping, so basically a lot going on, we've configured the formula to show only the data related to our close date grouping because that's what we ultimately needed. So always keep that in mind. No matter how complicated your reports may appear, it's possible to have precision with these formulas when you know exactly what you need to show and where. Okay, gang, brace yourselves for this last one because we're taking things up a notch. For our final requirement, let's say our team wants to know by how much the opportunity amount changed each fiscal period compared to the last. And they want to see this change reflected as a percentage at each stage. So the formula for this will be the current fiscal period amount minus the previous amount as a percentage of the previous amount. Now, same deal as before. We're using a combo of PREVGROUPVAL and PREVGROUPVAL to get at this requirement. Okay, let's go into the report builder and create our formula. I'm going to call this percent change per fiscal period. Let's see if I zoom in, is that better? No. Okay, so now let's plug in the calculation that I just went over using only the formula syntaxes to start. Again, that's the difference between the current fiscal period amount and the previous fiscal period amount over the previous amount. Now remember, PEMDAS and order of mathematical operations, we're going to put this subtraction part of the equation in parentheses. Okay, and remember, it's that difference divided by our previous amount. Let's plug in what we need. We're only concerned with the opportunity amount sum, so I'll plug those into all my formulas now. Now remember, for our first parent group val function, we need to specify both the row and column groupings when we're working in matrix reports. So we already know that our row grouping level across all of our formulas will be fiscal period. And because we're concerned with showing the percent change in relation to our different stages, our column grouping level for our parent group val function should be stage. For our display, we'll select fiscal period for our row grouping and stage for our column grouping, since that's where we want to show our calculation. And we have an error here because I did not remove the increment step in our PREVGROUPVAL functions. We don't have to set this because we're only looking at the first previous grouping level. Okay, good to go. Now let's use conditional formatting again to make this easier, or easier to see, rather. All right, so let's say anything that's negative will show in orange. And anything greater than 0 will show in blue. Okay, gang, so we've technically met the requirement, but let's talk about what we're looking at here. Our PREVGROUPVAL function is returning the percent change in relation to the previous fiscal period within each stage level. So all of the errors that we're seeing here are mathematical, right? Because the opportunity amount that we're using in the calculation is 0. And you can't have 0 as your divisor. So that's why we have all of the error formulas here. Technically, if we wanted to do this properly, what we should have done in our formula is set it up so that in the event that our divisor is a 0, the formula just returns 0 instead of an error. But that's okay. If we look here, within our closed one column grouping for Q3 2015, we can see that the difference between 60,000 and 2 million is about 3,200% of an increase. And similarly, for Q4 2015, that 345,000 is reflecting an 82% drop from our 2.2 million in Q3 2015. So hopefully that makes sense and gives you a better idea of how you might use PREVGROUPVAL, especially in relation to PREVGROUPVAL, to meet some of your org's business requirements. And there you have it, gang. I hope this video was helpful for understanding and imagining how you might use PREVGROUPVAL to take your reporting to the next level. If this video was helpful, please give it a thumbs up, and for more videos like this, be sure to subscribe. Thanks.